Boneyards of the Cold War is a response to a history of the 20th century and a personal history of my family involving the Cold War in Cambodia. And it's a very complicated history that can't be easily summarized in a few sentences, but just to give a little bit of context, in the 1970s, the US military dropped over 2.7 million tons of bombs on Cambodia, which was a neutral country in the Cold War up to that point. This was the beginning of a very, very dark chapter in Cambodian history. So after the US bombing, a genocide ensued in which the Khmer Rouge regime killed 1.7 million people, a quarter of the population. And it's a history that happened over 40 years ago, but is still a legacy that an entire generation of people who survived the war and genocide still live with. Their children still live with this memory. And so part of this piece is my way of responding to this history as part of a larger project. And this particular essay is a personal reflection of a space that I see as bearing witness to this complicated history. As a writer, I generally am working on the piece as an ongoing process, so it's hard for me to really separate the writing from the editing in a very clear way, because I think as a writer, it's just a constantly evolving and in process of writing. So what I try to do is get to a state where I'm comfortable with the piece, but I definitely don't see it as a finished process. My name is Y-Dang Troeung, that's my birth name. And when I submitted this piece to Brick, I asked the Brick editor to publish the essay under a pseudonym, Kid Teo. I wanted to do this because I saw the pseudonym as a part of the creative nonfiction experiment of the piece as a whole. So I saw the pseudonym as integral to the exploration of naming and the instability of naming and the kind of different versions of myself that is central to the theme of the piece. So I had asked the Brick editor if it was okay to publish it under a pseudonym, which in some ways is not really a pseudonym, but just a different way of spelling my name. So for example, I say in the piece that I was named after the refugee camp where I was born, which was known as Y-Dang, a refugee camp on the border of Cambodia and Thailand in the aftermath of the Cambodian genocide. Refugees fled to this refugee camp, and it was a camp that swelled to the size of a small city of 130,000 people. So it's a historical place, and my parents wanted to remember the history of their survival, and they gave me the name Y-Dang after this place named Y-Dang, which was short for kid, K-I-D. So that is why I adopted that pseudonym, K-I-D. It's July 2018. In a few days, I'll be packing up my family and flying across the Pacific from Hong Kong to Vancouver. The thought of being so far away from Cambodia pains me deeply. There is so much, I feel, I have failed to do. The more I've seen in Cambodia, the more desperate I've become to stop time. It has been one thing to inherit the shadows of the past, another to walk among them. I arrive at the Cambodia War Remnants Museum, just outside of Siem Reap, about 5 kilometers south of the ancient ruins of Angkor Wat. In the sweltering afternoon heat, I take in the arresting sight of the fenced-in outdoor space. It is a compound that is simultaneously organic and a machine, a forest of tropical trees and a boneyard of decommissioned tanks, cannons, landmines, helicopters, rifles, and munitions of all sorts. Life worlds woven together. The military ruins, the waste remnants of empire, sprawl around me in a dizzying display. In the enclosure, dozens of obsolete war machines are interspersed randomly among the banyan and palm trees. At a glance, the rusted brown tanks and aircraft carriers merge seamlessly with the browns of the trees, soil, and pits. Like Angkor Wat and now Troeung and Tulslang, the remains of war here are starting to be reclaimed by nature. I'm astounded that such a place exists, surprised it has fallen off the radar in the dozens of times I've been to Siem Reap. I think of all the time I've spent in cemeteries and graveyards as a child, but none like this. I feel shaken and off balance, unsure of how to move through such a ghostly area. It's as if I stand at the center of something, yet I know this place is off the map.
Y-Dang, I note in this first paragraph that sentences 2 to 4 certainly underwent a transformation between the original version and the final version. Could you please explain how you decided to add more content there, your thoughts around what to include as the process continued through to the final stages?
In the original version, it's a very fragmented opening. It's quite spare in details, and it doesn't contain a lot of detail about myself as the writer, even though it's a piece of creative nonfiction. It's kind of a fragmented part of a larger project. What the Brick editor suggested is that I position myself a little bit more clearly in that opening paragraph so that the reader could kind of connect with who I was and situate themselves in the sort of time and place of the piece. So in the original opening, there is this line that says, "The thought of being so far away from Cambodia pains me deeply. There's so much I feel I have failed to do." And what the Brick editor suggested is that the reader might not be able to have a full understanding of what I mean by the thought of being so far away from Cambodia pains me deeply. It's evident in relation to my larger project, but in this isolated essay, the reader needs more detail to understand the pain that I'm trying to express. And so when the Brick editor suggested that I add more there, I thought that was a great suggestion, and I agreed with that. And I tried to find a way to give a little bit more detail without necessarily over-explaining or providing too much. So that was where I arrived at the revised opening paragraph, where I explained that, 6 years ago, I had moved to Asia to take a job and then to be closer to Cambodia, which is the land of my parents' birth. And my goal was to spend that time writing a book, a scholarly and a personal book, which would be about this history that has been very little represented, that is a very difficult history to write about. However, during the course of those 6 years, I had a very difficult time with my goal, and I felt that by the end of this 6 years, I failed to really write this book.
I noticed that the second and the third paragraphs are merged as the editing process continues into one. Wondering about how that took place and the language that was used.
So the original version of Boneyards of the Cold War contained many small fragmented paragraphs of 2 to 3 sentences each. And I think this was a reflection of my state of mind at the time, my feeling of ungroundedness, just my fragmented thoughts about this space that I hadn't fully processed or was just kind of beginning to process. And so that was how I arrived at the original version. And there were one of the suggestions that were made to me by the Brick editor was to just combine some of the short fragmented paragraphs to sort of thematically link different fragments together so that they became a little bit more coherent.
Not only did you combine these 2 paragraphs, but there was a considerable amount of additional information added to the end of it. Could you explain how you decided to add that piece to its contents and add more of a personal bent to it?
In the final essay, I added some personal information about myself to link different spaces and times. So most of the original piece focused more traditionally on my reflections on visiting the War Remnant Museum in Cambodia, my experience walking through the space. But I think the Brick editor wanted me to try and give more details about myself again, so that the piece could be a better reflection of not only there in Cambodia, but potentially the other spaces where I have lived and the longer life that I've lived. So I wanted to give more specificity about why I saw this particular space in Cambodia as being significant, the War Remnant Museum that I was writing about. And I wanted to explain that it's a really off the map kind of unknown space. I'd never heard of it before, even though I'd visited Cambodia dozens and dozens of times. And it's right beside an attraction that just draws millions of tourists every year, which is kind of iconic in Cambodia, which is the Angkor Wat, the ancient ruins of Angkor Wat. So in some ways, my visit to the War Remnant Museum, which I call a boneyard, was significant because it's right beside this massive tourist attraction which everybody associates with Cambodia. And then there's this hidden space which reflects so much of Cambodia's difficult history, which I see as a kind of living archive or a testimonial to what happened during the war, what happened during the genocide that, over 6 million people experienced, but yet nobody visits this boneyard. It's unknown. People who do visit it seem to be treating it in a very distanced way or approaching it in a more kind of commodified or sensational way. And so what I wanted to do was just spend a little bit more time in this paragraph trying to articulate why I saw this place as significant and what it means, I think, in the kind of memory of Cambodian history. And so I added the details about its proximity to Angkor Wat. I also added the details about what was contained at this museum, all kinds of decommissioned war material, all kinds of weapons, old artillery. It's just filled with all of these war machines that were used during the Cold War in Cambodia. And in the past, people used to scrap this material in order to make a living, as they do in many parts of Southeast Asia. So it's significant because it is a testimony to the ways that people survive war in places like Cambodia. Moving from there, I wanted to then move to a third space, which was the space of my childhood in Canada, in small town, southwestern Ontario, where I grew up and where my family came to in the 1980s as refugees. I saw a kind of layering of these two spaces, like the boneyard in Cambodia and the kind of graveyards that I used to spend a lot of time in as a child, because when I was a child, my parents, as many refugees do, have to go out and pick worms for a living. So they do that, with permission from farmers or from the owners of the spaces. And they scavenge the ground for earthworms, and then they sell them to farmers who use them for fishing or whatever. And so it's a sort of the space of the War Remnant Museum triggered my memory of spending a lot of time as a child sleeping in the car while my parents would walk through the graveyards at night picking worms to earn a living in their early days as refugees in Canada. It's July 2018. Today is the last day of my visit to Siem Reap. Later this afternoon, I have to catch my flight, and the thought of being so far away from Cambodia pains me deeply. I have failed to do so much. 6 years ago, I moved to Asia to take a job as a professor and to be closer to Cambodia. I longed for proximity to my parents' birthplace, to see with my own eyes the landscapes of their past. I hoped to lay down some kind of record of the war they had survived, to write a book that my mother and father and brothers could see themselves in. But many things in Cambodia have taken me by surprise. It is one thing to inherit the shadows of the past, another to walk among them. I arrived at the Cambodia War Remnant Museum, just outside of Siem Reap, about 5 kilometers south of the ancient ruins of Angkor Wat. In the sweltering afternoon heat, I take in the arresting sight of the fenced-in outdoor space. Dozens of obsolete war machines are interspersed among the banyan and palm trees. At a glance, the rusted brown tanks and aircraft carriers merge seamlessly with the browns of the trees, soil, and pits. The remains of war are starting to be reclaimed by nature. Life worlds woven together. Unlike the nearby ruins of the ancient Angkor Empire, an attraction that draws millions of tourists each year, this boneyard feels hidden from the world. Inside the museum, I learned that war material in Cambodia used to be scrapped for recycled metal. People salvaged what they could to make a living. I've spent time in graveyards as a child, alone in the car at night as my family members scavenged the ground for earthworms they could sell to farmers. Back then, I felt excitement at watching my parents move among the dead. But today, I feel unsure of how to move through such a ghostly area.